So, you all ready to take exam two? You're not yet because you haven't watched the review video. I'm going to try to give you a real good summary of what the exam is going to cover. Before I dive into that, though, I want to remind you that the exam is going to be using a program called Respondus Monitor. You need to have an operable webcam with the computer. You also need to have a semi-private space, and you're allowed to use the cheat sheet as always. You'll see in D2L there is something called a test quiz or something like that, practice quiz. I forget exactly the name I've given it. And it's available for you over the weekend. That practice quiz has one purpose only, and that is to give you a chance to use Respondus Monitor to get the kinks worked out, if you will. The problem is not with the software or with the service. If you have trouble getting into it, it's because you're not doing something right. It's been used millions of times. And just so you know, this is a way to level the playing field and make sure that everybody is going to abide by the rules for taking the exam and no one's going to cheat. What the program does is it uses your webcam to record your face and your voice, and also record what's on your screen so that I can review that if there's any allegations of cheating. It's very important that you keep your face so that it can be seen. And the easiest way to make sure that you don't get confused with the cheating, as opposed to looking down. If you want to use your cheat sheet, lift your cheat sheet up and look at it again where I can see it in the webcam, and I'll know what you're doing when I review the webcam footage. So practice it and be ready to use it. So let's get into the exam. Like last time, it's going to be 40 multiple choice questions. You're going to have 60 minutes to complete the exam. So let's dive into the Chapter 5 review. Remember that when we're talking about competition, we're looking at the center box of Porter's 5 forces. And the idea is as rivalry goes up, typically profitability in the firms goes down. There are 2 questions that are going to ask you to assess how great a competitor people are, and they're going to rely more on market commonality than they are on testing the awareness, motivation, and capability. However, all of these things are going to tie into this idea of likelihood of attack and likelihood of response. So you'll see several questions that will talk about how likely they are to attack and how likely they are to respond. So you need to understand these concepts. Be sure that you know the difference between a tactical attack and a strategic attack. I would know every bullet on this chart because this is going to help you sort out the competitive responses or the competitive likelihood to attack. As far as it's going to ask you how second movers try to profit, so it's important to know characteristics of first movers versus second movers and what leads to success. Really nothing on the speed of the markets, I don't think. And then remember that I talked about this competitive grid. Remember, skirmishing is where I think most companies are most of the time. It's relatively low intensity. They're attacking firms that are like them, and they're just kind of jousting with each other. War is when somebody really tries to achieve a superior position. Arguably, this is what Amazon and Walmart are doing today with their battle for online supremacy. Defeating, on the other hand, is when you take out somebody that's weaker than you or particularly vulnerable. Remember, I illustrated that with how Bed Bath & Beyond took out linens and things. And then dominate. I gave you the example of how Microsoft made a capital injection into Apple to allow them to survive. Obviously, it came back to bite them. But why do firms allow dominated competitors to stick around? Well, it's twofold. One, it creates a false appearance of competition, and so it keeps people from entering the market. It also makes the appearance of things are being fair and played out competitively when in fact the dominated firm really isn't much of a factor. And so, I mean, this is a nice summary, but we've already talked about everything in the exam on Chapter 5. On to Chapter 6. Now, as we get into corporate strategies, Chapter 6, the questions involve matters of diversification. And so a very important thing that I want you to understand is that the fundamental test, if you will, is, are these entities better off together than they would be separately? And that's called the better off test. And then the magic word is synergy. And we use that criteria of 1 + 1 = 3, which is to say the sum of the parts are worth more when they're combined than when they're separate. Also, when you get into some of the acquisition strategies, there's going to be a question about private synergy. And so you're going to want to be up on the private synergy. But this is a very important concept. And just understanding these bullets on this slide will give you the tip on a lot of answers. And then there's going to be some general questions where you're going to have to look at, for example, these issues of market power and economies of scope. Not particular things per se, but you're going to have to spot which is at play. So one of the key things to understand is economies of scope and what goes in economies of scope and how it differs from economies of scale. So just be familiar with this because you're going to need to be able to separate out what's happening. Again, I don't test these words, so you don't need to worry about that. And then this idea of relatedness, that the Procter & Gamble example just illustrated that, and what kind of sharing companies are trying to achieve determines the moderate versus high level of diversification. So down here, where you're not trying to share core competencies, you're not trying to share activities, that would be an unrelated diversification, where this would be a highly related matter of diversification. Be able to understand what market power does from a diversification standpoint. And unrelated diversification, I want you to spot when it is an unrelated diversification. There's also a specific question on when does the strategy of resource allocation or internal markets work well for an unrelated diversification strategy. Nothing on the bad ideas. Just keeping in mind this firm, which is unrelated or very relatively low levels of diversification, tend to outperform better than either unrelated or single business will also help you figure out the answers to some questions. Okay, on now to mergers and acquisitions. It's important that you understand that a takeover equals an unwelcome approach. Usually I put the word hostile in front of that, but in the test question, that word may or may not be there. In an acquisition, we talked about how well does it work. If you're the acquirer, on average, the returns are zero, which is to say it's not a guaranteed winner or loser. That's different for the target firm. If a firm is approached by another firm, almost always it works out well for the shareholders of the target firm. If you remember, I joked in class that you should be so lucky as to have a firm, own stock in a firm that becomes a target, because you're almost always going to sell, or you're almost always going to get a nice bump up in your stock of 25 or even more %. And my advice on that is sell, take it, because they don't always work out well in the long run. I really drilled down on the fact that not all acquisitions are alike. Make sure you understand the difference between consolidation, extension, and entrepreneurship, because one of the test questions is going to ask you to identify what type of acquisition it was. As a general tip to many questions on the exam, understand the difference between horizontal and vertical. Horizontal, you're typically in a company that does the same thing as you. If it's some sort of a vertical issue, it's someone who supplies you or you sell to. So that's going to, understanding those two words is going to give you about 4 test questions correct if you can apply them correctly. There's a question there about what are the advantages and disadvantages of a firm of using acquisitions to bring new products into the fold. So make sure that you're up on that. And then understanding how they go wrong is really the key. So this chart and this chart, and when you overpay, there will be a test question, and the problem was perhaps they overpaid, but it's going to show that they took on too much debt. And the reason you know they took on too much debt is because they needed to go out and sell more stock. And so understanding this chart as well will tend to answer a lot of questions. This idea of managerial distractions is one of the problems. It's just that when an M&A is in play, people have a lot of attention to that, and they don't pay any attention to the business that's actually making money. No questions here, surprisingly. I don't know how I let that happen. Okay. Okay, now we're into the global world. There's going to be a question on internationalism and regionalism and globalization, so make sure that you can spot and understand what constitutes a regionalization or a regional strategy. There's going to be one question to understand what are the benefits of going global. There are several questions they're going to ask you to compare and contrast a global strategy, transnational strategy, and multi-domestic strategy. So you're going to need to understand just the elements of each of these three strategies so you understand the pros and cons between them, and also be able to identify them when they describe a firm's strategy. And then there's going to be a question about that's going to give you a sense of what degree of ownership or control you want to have, and based on that, what type of entry strategy you should use. So make sure you understand that. Very simple question, should be an easy one about just spotting the liability of foreignness. So make sure that you're up on that. And also another question on, does a strong dollar help or hurt a U.S. manufacturer that exports goods? So very straightforward there. One more chapter to go. Last chapter, number 9, alliances, cooperative strategies. So there's going to be just a question that talks about the benefits of the strategy, and also remember I talked about that in many ways it has the same benefits as a merger and acquisition without some of the costs. And this chart should allow you to remember what some of those specific costs are. You're going to need to be able to spot something that's a joint venture. You're also going to be able to spot in a test question what constitutes a non-equity alliance. No particular question off this slide, I don't think. Make sure you understand a horizontal and vertical complementary strategic alliance. You'll be picking one of those out in the exam. Also, there's one question on the responsibilities of the franchisor when they're pursuing a franchising corporate level strategy. You can just get that right out of the textbook. Then several questions are about what goes wrong in alliances. Remember that opportunist behavior is when they don't share the things that you think they're supposed to share, and they're basically trying to take advantage of you. All of these things are also elements. When it comes to the contracts, there's a question on there about the cost minimization versus opportunity maximization, which, if you remember in the textbook, they like to use the term cost minimization when it's a very, very structured, rigid contract, and opportunity maximization when it's not as structured or delineated. And so I told you in the lecture, this is, in my view, one of the most important questions to ask yourself as you go into an alliance. So make sure that you're aware of that. And again, there's those two terms that you're going to want to be familiar with. Then we talked about the case of the Boeing 787 and how one of the liabilities of alliances that the textbook doesn't talk about is the fact that you often lose visibility on key issues and you lose some control. And in the case of Boeing and the 787, that really bit them. So again, to review the exam is going to be 40 questions using Respondus Monitor, multiple choice. You'll have 60 minutes to complete the exam, and at the end of the exam, it'll tell you what questions you got wrong. Good luck, and reach out to me this weekend if you have questions.